Hello everyone! It has been 3 months since my last review of Microsoft vulnerabilities for fourth quarter of 2020. In this episode, I want to review the Microsoft vulnerabilities for the first quarter of 2021. There will be 4 parts: January, February, March, and the vulnerabilities that were released between the patch Tuesdays. I will be using the reports that I created with my Vulristics tool. This time I will try to make the episodes shorter. I will describe only the most critical vulnerabilities. Links to the full reports are at the bottom of the blog post. So let's start. January 2021. What was interesting in January? The only critical vulnerability was Microsoft Defender Remote Code Execution, CVE 2021-1647. Quote, Microsoft stated that this vulnerability was exploited before the patches were made available. This patch should be prioritized. The most interesting high-level vulnerability is Microsoft SPL WoW 64 Elevation of Privilege, CVE 2021-1648. Quote, according to Maddie Stone, a researcher at Google Project Zero, credited with identifying this vulnerability, CVE 2021-1648 as a patch bypass for CVE 2020-09-86, which was exploited in the wild as a zero-day. Also, vendors paid attention to a large number of remote procedure call runtime remote code executions and Windows Remote Desktop Security Feature Bypass, CVE 2021-1669. But there are still no signs of exploitation for them. They are all labeled high in the Vulristics report. So there were no exploits for any of the January vulnerabilities, and January was a quiet and a calm month. Next one is February 2021. One urgent level vulnerability is elevation of privilege in Win32k component of Windows 10 and Windows Server 2019, CVE 2021-1732. According to Microsoft, this vulnerability has been exploited in the wild. Quote, successful exploitation would elevate the privileges of an attacker, potentially allowing them to create new accounts, install programs, and view, modify, or delete data. Public exploit in a form of Metasploit module is found at Vulners. It's called Windows 32k console control offset confusion. But the situation with other critical vulnerabilities is interesting. None of the vulnerability management vendors mentioned them in their Patch Tuesday reviews. This is Microsoft Exchange Server spoofing vulnerability, CVE 2021-240-85, which is mentioned on Attacker KB and for which public exploit is found at Vulners. It's called Microsoft Exchange Server MS-ECP Canary, CSRF Privilege Escalation. And this is not the same vulnerability that was exploited in Hafnium. We'll get to those vulnerabilities later. 2 other vulnerabilities were exploited in the wild. Windows Win32k Elevation of Privilege vulnerability, CVE 2021-1698, and Microsoft Exchange Server, CVE 2021-1730. Therefore, the Vulristics vulnerability score is higher for them. If vulnerability management vendors ignored these vulnerabilities, what vulnerabilities did they mention in their reports? Primarily, they wrote about Windows TCP/IP remote code execution vulnerabilities. Quote, Microsoft released a set of fixes affected Windows TCP/IP implementation that include 2 critical remote code execution (RCE) vulnerabilities, CVE 2021-240 and 78 and CVE 2021-240-94, and an important denial of service DOS vulnerability, CVE 2021-240-86, While there is no evidence that these vulnerabilities are exploited in the wild, these vulnerabilities should be prioritized given their impact. Also, they wrote about Windows DNS Server Remote Code Execution vulnerability CVE 2021-240 and 78. Quote, remote code execution flaw within Windows Server installation when configured as DNS server, affecting Windows Server versions from 2008 to 2019, including server core installations. This severe flaw is considered more likely to be exploited and received a CVSS version 3 score of 9.8. This bug is exploitable by a remote attacker with no requirements for using interaction or a privileged account. As this vulnerability affects DNS servers, it is possible this flaw could be wormable and spread within a network. But for these two vulnerabilities, there are still no public exploits or signs of active exploitation in the wild. This, of course, doesn't mean that these vulnerabilities do not need to be fixed. When we see the exploitation of these vulnerabilities in the wild, it will be a disaster. Let's go further. March 2021. And again, we see in the top not exactly the same vulnerabilities that VM vendors pointed out in their reviews. Windows Container Execution Agent Elevation of Privilege Vulnerability CVE 2021-26891. Just because a public exploit was found at Vulners, Microsoft Windows Containers Privilege Escalation. And the second one, Internet Explorer Memory Corruption CVE 2021-26411. Quote, a memory corruption vulnerability in Internet Explorer that was exploited in the wild as a 0-day. In order to exploit the flaw, an attacker would need to host the exploit code on a malicious website and convince a user through a social engineering tactics to visit the page. Or the attacker could inject the malicious payload into a legitimate website. Exploitation in the wild is mentioned at attacker KB. But we also see several Windows DNS server remote code executions. Quote, all 5 of these CVEs were assigned 9 and 8 CVSS version 3 score and can be exploited by an unauthenticated attacker when dynamic updates are enabled. According to an analysis by researchers at McAfee, these CVEs are not considered wormable. Yet they do evoke memories of CVE 2020-1350 cigarette, a 17-year-old wormable flaw patched in July 2020. In general, updating DNS server is never a bad thing. And where is the most important thing? Naturally, these are Exchange vulnerabilities, and they were published between patch Tuesdays. I made a special script to get such CVEs. So, other first quarter 2021. The 7 critical vulnerabilities are those Microsoft Exchange Server remote code executions exploited in recent attacks. They have signs of exploitation in the wild at attacker KB and Microsoft. However, we still do not see public exploits. So, big quote. Proxy login is the formerly generic name for CVE 2021-26855. A vulnerability on Microsoft Exchange Server that allows an attacker bypassing the authentication and impersonating as the admin. We have also changed this bug with another post-auth arbitrary file write vulnerability, CVE 2021-217-65, to get code execution. All affected components are vulnerable by default. As a result, an unauthenticated attacker can execute arbitrary commands on Microsoft Exchange Server through an only open port 443. Everything is extremely serious with these vulnerabilities, and if you have public unpatched Exchange servers, then there is a good chance that you have already been hacked. For example, by Hafnium. Quote, Hafnium is a state-sponsored threat actor identified by the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, MSTIC. Another quote, recently Hafnium has engaged in a number of attacks using previously unknown exploits targeting on-premises Exchange server software. To date, Hafnium is a primary actor we have seen use these exploits, which are discussed in detail by MSTIC here. The attacks included 3 steps. First, it would gain access to an Exchange server, either with stolen passwords or by using the previously undiscovered vulnerabilities to disguise itself as someone who should have access. Second, it would create what's called a web shell to control the compromised server remotely. Third, it would use that remote access run from the US-based private servers to steal data from an organization's network. In short, these Exchange vulnerabilities are the top. The rest are Chrome vulnerabilities, simply because Microsoft's browser is now based on Chrome. Once again, you can download full versions of reports in the blog post for Patch Tuesday, January 2021, Patch Tuesday, February 2021, Patch Tuesday, March 2021, and Patch Tuesday, Other, First Quarter 2021. That's all for today. Thanks for your time and attention.